Good afternoon and welcome to the Aga Khan Museum. My name is Sharmeen Beg and I'm here to welcome you to the Aga Khan Museum today and to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Over the last week, our speaker for today, Professor Michael Berry, presented two splendid lectures, the first on Alexander the Great, the second on Behram Gur, Dragons and Ideas of Kingship. Today he will take us on a journey of representations of the theme of courtly love in visual culture. Professor Michael Berry teaches at Princeton University, both as a historian of Islamic art and a historian of the Middle East and Islamic world. For the museum world, Michael Berry is known for his role as consultative chairman of the Department of Islamic Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art from 2005 to 2009, in preparation for their new galleries that opened in 2011. He was also a consultant of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, which is the umbrella institution for the Aga Khan Museum as well, where he helped in conceptualizing this museum and its offerings to the public. Michael Berry is an established authority on Islamic art, but also on the history and culture of Afghanistan. He has various publications, both in English and French, on Afghanistan, where he served more than 20 years under the most dangerous conditions of war as an international humanitarian officer for the International Federation of Human Rights, Médecins du Monde, and the United Nations. And that resulted in his most recent book in the English language on the subject of Kabul's Long Shadows, published by Princeton University in 2011. His publications on Islamic art are numerous, and his books on the topic include a history of medieval Islamic figurative painting from the 15th to the 16th centuries, figurative art in medieval Islam, and the riddle of Behzad of Herat, and more recently, the beautifully illustrated new translation and study of Attar's The Chronicle of the Birds. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Berry.
Hello, everybody. It's very exciting to talk about courtly love, the idea that a noble knight, a doughty warrior, finds true nobility in submission to a lady who will more often than not remain absolutely inaccessible to him, so that he will suffer for the love of his lady and through his suffering become ennobled, until finally the medieval courtly tradition transfigures this notion into a mystical journey whereby the loving soul, usually portrayed as male, but not always, through love for the divine manifestation of beauty upon the face of the beloved, who is always unattainable, reaches a state of spiritual, mystical ecstasy, such as to result in a revelation of the divine itself. Now, there has been some question, hotly debated ever since the early 20th century, on whether the extraordinarily similar patterns of this courtly love tradition to be found in medieval European Christendom and in medieval Islam have anything to do with each other, or are they pure coincidence? In fact, pretty much since the 1930s, there has been a growing school of thought that comes to the conclusion that the influence of Islamic Spain and its courtly love tradition, its own courtly love tradition, was so overwhelming on the southwestern European Christian courts that ultimately the growth of what came to be known as l'amour courtois, courtly love, and the troubadour tradition, beginning at the very end of the 11th and the early 12th century in southwestern France, owes a tremendous amount to these Spanish Islamic models. So, without further ado, we have here an image of what we could call truly Spanish Islamic chivalry. This is an image from a beautiful ivory casket dating from the early 11th century, which fortunately survived the generalized destruction of Islamic artworks in Spain in the 15th century because it had become part of a cathedral treasure. It's still known as the Pamplona casket. And this detail of it shows a prince overcoming two lions in order to win the crown. Those of us who are of Persian cultural tradition will immediately recognize who this prince is. It is Prince Bahram-i-Gur, who conquered the crown of Persia because he was the only one to dare bound into the arena where the crown was set between two unchained lions, and he slew both lions and obtained the crown, recognized as the prince of the true blood royal. Now, this story circulated throughout the entire Islamic world and came to be associated with a symbol of kingship. We have it in Arabic romances, which were written in Spain and Sicily, and we can already detect versions of these romances in medieval French. And in one particular case, which I think will tickle your fancy, we know that at the outset of the 100 Years' War, Edward III, King of England, Plantagenet, challenged the new King of France, Philip VI, Valois, to prove his title to the crown of France. Edward III sent a message to the Pope saying, "Let the crown of France be placed between two unchained lions, and let Philip dare pick it up. I will dare pick it up." And historians have often wondered, where did they find lions for such a contest, which actually never took place in Paris or London in the 14th century? Well, this is a clear case of the influence through the Middle East, up through Spain, into Western European culture. So I'll go on from this, and now we arrive at the most famous of the Western courtly romances. This is Sir Lancelot. Lancelot shown conquering his title to become the Queen's champion by overcoming twin dragons and then twin lions from a 15th century French manuscript. Or here we have the motif recarved again for the King and Queen of Spain at the end of the 15th century, the Catholic sovereigns, where the escutcheon clearly appears between the twin lions. Now, King Arthur, here in a beautiful 14th century French tapestry, stands as kind of the center of a whole tradition of noble knights who, through love for their lady, attain even higher nobility. Mostly Lancelot himself. Lancelot, for those of you with French, you would probably be astounded to realize that until the 16th century, French manuscript writing would not put in an apostrophe. So l'étoile, the star, would just be written Leostoile. Lancelot, if you put in an apostrophe, gets you en solo, which means the servant, as an ancillary. It means it's not so much a name as a function. Lancelot is ennobled by his love for the Queen. The Queen is unattainable. The Queen is another man's wife. The Queen, Guinevere, is Arthur's queen. But Lancelot will save her when she has been taken captive by an evil lord, and he comes to the castle where she is imprisoned, which is in fact a symbol of Hell Castle, Hades. And to cross over into that castle, he has to cross over a bridge which looks like a sharp sword, which is taken directly from ancient Persian mythology and was adapted into Islamic culture with the idea that souls moving from this lower world into the next world must cross over a bridge as sharp as a sword, and if they are not worthy, they will cut their hands and feet and fall into the abyss, whereas those who are saved will be able to go to the other side. And we can actually see that Lancelot, moving over this sword bridge, will then have to encounter the twin lions. All this from a manuscript of the Arthurian romances, the most completely illustrated one we have, that was copied for Lord Jacques d'Armagnac, who was beheaded on orders of Louis XI in 1477. So this is exactly contemporary to Sir Thomas Malory's English language renditions. So here we have another case of the humiliation of the knight. The knight Lancelot, whom we recognize by his shield argent with 3 bands of gules, meaning 3 red bands, those are his armorial symbols, has lost his horse in battle, and in order to reach the castle where his ladylove is imprisoned, he accepts to be carried thither in a lowly cart, the kind that was used to ferry victims to their execution, as if you were a condemned criminal. It's a case of extreme self-humiliation, so that Lancelot became known in one of the earliest French language romances to survive from the 12th century by Chrétien de Troyes. He is the knight of the cart, le chevalier à la charrette. And the sentiment expressed by this self-humiliation appears in the earliest poem of courtly love in the Western European Christian tradition to survive by Count William of Aquitaine in southwestern France, who at the very beginning of the 12th century served in Aragon against the Spanish Muslims in the Spanish Crusade. And when he returned, he wrote this: "Surely no one can ever be love's perfect man unless he gives it homage in humility. Every joy must abase itself, and every might obey in the presence of Midance," meaning my suzerain, my lady, for the sweetness of her welcome, for her beautiful and gentle look. And a man who wins to the joy of her love will live 100 years. The joy of her can make the sick man well again. Her wrath can make a well man die. A wise man turn to childishness. A beautiful man, behold his beauty change. The courtliest man can become a churl, as here, and any churl a courtly man. This is the frontispiece to this whole cycle of Arthurian romances, therefore copied in the 1460s in France. On the upper left, here you have the supposed author, Walter Map. He's not the real author of it, who was a courtier at the English French language court in London in the 12th century before his king, Henry II Plantagenet. Then you have here the birth of Lancelot. Here, Lancelot arriving at the court and knighted by King Arthur. And here, Lancelot in armor, winning entry into a magic castle, another representation of Death Castle. It is called Dolorous Garde, la Garde, la Douloureuse Garde, and it is defended by these strange automat statues. This, again, is taken directly from the Islamic romance, The Tale of the City of Brass, which is an epic surrounding the Islamic conquest of Spain, where such a castle appears. And the origin of that Spanish Islamic myth ultimately goes back to an ancient Persian prototype. It's the conquest of the brazen castle of the other world by the hero Isfandiar. So you get this transmission from Persia through the Arab world, through Spain, and up into France and England. Then here, King Arthur listens to Lancelot telling of his exploits. Here you have the dangerous part beginning. Lancelot's love for Queen Guinevere is so strong that he is afraid that he might fall into sin and betray his lord through adultery. And so he wants to leave the court, but here is Guinevere kneeling at the feet of Lancelot. You are my king's champion. You are my husband's favorite knight. Please do not leave. Well, this will lead to the tragedy. This illumination shows the moment when Lancelot's friend, got that one wrong. Lancelot's friend Gallio, as he's called in the French, introduces Lancelot to Queen Guinevere. They should be alone. Actually, here they're ladies in waiting, and this is their first kiss, their adulterous kiss, which was facilitated by Gallio. For those of you who might love Dante, we have a wonderful moment in the first circle of hell, the first group of people to be damned. Those are lovers who were incapable of overcoming their illicit passion, and therefore their souls are carried by the wind as if storks in a spring tempest. And two of these lovers, interrogated by Dante, who weeps over their fate, happen to be an adulterous couple of late 13th century Italy who were put to death by the husband of the wife, of course. And the two say to Dante, what caused us to fall into such sin was to read together of the book of Lancelot. And when we read how Lancelot, in presence of Guinevere, turned pale, and Queen Guinevere turned pale, and suddenly Lancelot leaned forth and kissed her on the mouth, tutto tremante, all trembling. Then we looked at each other and we kissed. And truly, Gallio was he who wrote the book and so condemned us to eternal damnation. Now, Dante writes, after I heard this, I fainted, because Dante proclaims, my love for the lady Beatrice, who is unattainable to me, first in this life because she was married to another man, and then she died, and so she is even further unattainable because she is in the other world. Love for her will lead me as she appears unto me in a dream vision to carry me through the other world unto the very threshold of the divine. So it's the supreme masterpiece of courtly love in Western literature, but Dante singles out this particular episode to show the danger of courtly love, which must be based on renunciation of actual carnal desire. So here we have the exchange of rings between Lancelot and Queen Guinevere while King Arthur's back is turned. Then here we have the numerous combats of Lancelot against various knights who suspect the adultery, betray the secret guilty passion of Lancelot and Guinevere to the king. Lancelot is constantly championing her innocence and overcoming knights in battle or forcing them to show homage to the queen. Or here, Guinevere most upset because Lancelot is absent from the bed in which they meet. This is because Lancelot has been abducted by 3 fairies. And these fairies will take him into the chamber of another castle where the lovely lady Elaine, disguised as Queen Guinevere, will come to him in the night and conceive by him. And in the morning, Lancelot, in a rage, realizing that he has been deceived, wishes to kill her, but he will forbear because she will indeed be the mother of Galahad. Here, Queen Guinevere has heard about this tryst, and she's very angry with Lancelot. She marches into the chamber and orders him out of the castle, and for a while he roams through the woods, dressed only in his shirt, mad. He will recover, and here we have the central mystery of the Arthurian romances. On the top left, what you see, of course, is the crucifixion and an angel here holding a chalice to catch the precious blood of the Lord. This will be the Holy Grail, which only one knight will be able to find. It was brought by legend to Britain by Joseph of Arimathea. Here, a messenger comes from the Lady Elaine to King Arthur's court, telling Lancelot, a child has been born to you who will achieve the Holy Grail. Lancelot rides forth to the castle where he meets with Galahad, surrounded by holy nuns, symbols of the Trinity. Truly, Galahad will achieve the Holy Grail because on his mother's side, he is a descendant of King David and King Solomon. Then here, the Round Table itself, in one of the more famous depictions of it from this same 15th century French manuscript, where we see that actually not even Arthur is the true Lord of the Round Table. Once the Holy Grail appears, the true king of the Round Table is Galahad. The perfect virginal knight. Lancelot's love for Queen Guinevere has prevented him from being he who will find the Grail. So Lancelot is to the side right there. Now we come to the interlacing of the Arthurian romance with another very famous medieval story, the good knight Tristram, who also adulterously loves the Queen Isolde, queen unto King Mark. The battles of Lancelot and Tristram will result in their friendship. We recognize Lancelot and Tristram. Then we come here to the final episode of the Tristram and Isolde story. Tristram has been wounded to death by King Mark, and as Tristram lies dying, Mark's queen Isolde gives him a parting kiss. He will not be able to overcome their adulterous love. Et Messire Tristan, le bon chevalier, et la reine Ise moururent tous deux ensemble en la place que le roi Marc, son oncle, lui eut faite. If you can follow the old French writing, and Messire Tristram, the good knight, and the Queen Isolde both died, both together in the chamber which King Mark, Tristram's uncle, had fashioned for them to trap them. And here, King Arthur's sister, Morgane la Fée, Morgane the Fairy, shows the carvings in Lancelot's chamber which betray to the king how Lancelot and the queen have been adulterous lovers here. So that, once again, Lancelot continuously, in one battle after another, ordeals carried out before the king and queen, tries to prove the queen's innocence by overcoming challenging knights. And in this case, Lancelot even has to intervene to prevent Queen Guinevere, convinced of adultery by her king and husband, from being burned at the stake. The Pope will finally intervene, and so King Arthur will leave his Queen Guinevere in the keeping of Mordred, his both son and nephew. His son by Morgane la Fée was actually the king's sister, and so he will be in the keeping of the crown of England while Arthur departs to France, there to find and destroy Lancelot, which will bring about the dissolution of the Order of the Round Table. So it's a tragedy of courtly love, and nevertheless, the fact that this was one of the most popular romances in medieval Christendom argues that this archetype was considered to be so ennobling for knights that when a much better artist, in this case Barthélemy d'Eck, for his king René of Provence, adorns a manuscript of the usages of tournaments, we find that the ladies come to inspect the helmets of all the knights who will fight in next day's tournament, and every knight considers that he must wear the colors of his lady love. In another illustration by the same artist, we have the allegory of King René de Provence, who is actually asleep, and the god of love takes his heart and gives it to good desire. So the whole romance unfolds like a wonderful dream. Here we have Heart, who is a knight now, wearing a heart upon his helmet, as upon the caparison of his horse, with good desire, who will be guided by a good fairy in the forest. The quest is the lady love. Or here, good knight Heart has actually been worsted in battle by the Black Knight, one of the obstacles, and has been cast into the river. Fortunately, the good lady Hope will be able to pull him out of the water. Comment Espérance tire le cœur hors de l'eau. How my lady Hope pulls Heart out of the water. Then here, this is an actual variation on the Arthurian romance. The knight Heart with his squires will embark on a mysterious boat with fairy ladies, finally to be taken to the other world. Now, the greatest examples of courtly love in the Western Christian tradition, of course, are Dante and Beatrice. And Beatrice leads Dante through the spheres that surround the earth until they will come to the very threshold of the divine in paradise. This is an illustration by Botticelli. Now, here is where we come to the Islamic tradition. Now, this early 13th century painting is one of the very, very few manuscript illuminations to survive from Islamic Spain, since after all, Cardinal Cisneros did a very good job in 1499 when he ordered a general bonfire of all Arabic language books throughout Spain, keeping aside only those that dealt with medicine. Fortunately, this manuscript has survived and is in the Vatican, and it shows the Spanish Islamic tradition of courtly love that might be described thus. This is a poem by the Emir of Cordova, Al-Hakam, who ruled in the early 9th century, and listen to how strange is the conceit. We think of Islamic civilization as patriarchal, rigidly separating the world of men from the world of women, and what do we get? Now, regarding his love lyrics, he had 5 slave girls, and these domineered over him and broke up any ties between him and all other women. One day the emir wished to bring other women into his household, but they refused this and stood in stark opposition to him. Since they rejected him, he sought to divert their attention and to mollify them, and so composed the following verses. They sway like willow branches on a dune and dominate me and wish to whisk me away. I implored them by my rights, but in revolt they persisted, even though I was devoid of revolt. Over me like queens they rule, and I a king, whose wishes are humbled through love. Humbled, a captive in chains, in submission. What for me to do with those who from my body have snatched up my very soul for desire, have snatched away from me my very majesty and royalty. And belonging to him regarding these women are also extant these verses, says the Chronicle. For too much love has waxed a slave, one who before was monarch. His desires weeping and his wailing only swelled such tyranny as to hasten his impending fate and death. In love below his castle, at the battlement's base, yearning he lies, abandoned on the hill. He pillows his cheek upon the earth for one who rests her cheek upon a silken cushion. But it is meet in the humility of love for a free man's yearning to reduce him to a slave. What this signifies is two of the strangest inversions in the sexual relations of classical Islamic civilization. One is the king as the all-purpose domineering male, women under his command, and yet the king shows his true nobility by kneeling before one of his women and inverting the roles. You are the queen, I am the slave. And this attitude ennobles me. The other, which we referred to briefly in our former lectures together this past week, has been the mystery of the unveiling, whereby in a civilization where the upper and higher middle classes were so cruelly segregated, for a young man, the veil which hid the face of the beloved becomes a spiritual allegory of all the mysteries of this visible world which hide from me the true countenance of the beloved. The wedding night, when the bride for the first time reveals her face to the bridegroom, is known as the kashful mahjub, meaning the unveiling of that which is veiled. And the appearance of the countenance becomes, in the medieval mystical poetry of the Islamic world, a supreme allegory of the manifestation of the divine made visible. Precisely because of this segregation, the yearning associated with overcoming the separation to discover the feature of the divine becomes a leading leitmotif of the poetry and helps explain why this was such a dominant motif in Spanish Islamic poetry and how this carried over into the language of Provençal, Old French, and Italian. It's not entirely an accident by any means. So we're going to look now at this tradition in Islamic art, and we should often be surprised by what we see. For example, here in this early 15th century illustration to the poetry of Saadi, we see another one of these typical scenes. This was done in Shiraz in about 1420. The young man going through the street smells a wonderful perfume. Very often in the romances will be described a market in which a noblewoman, a young noblewoman with her servant is in the market, and she's very heavily veiled with her servant, but the perfume wafts through the streets and a young man is smitten by the perfume. And then a gust of wind will suddenly, accidentally blow aside the veil, and the young man will have a glimpse of she who will live in his heart forevermore. And then he will follow her as she shuts the door to her house and usually sit there in the street, hoping that one day maybe his parents will arrange a marriage with her. So this is a very common motif. And what you get here is the variant where the young man beholds the beloved at her window. And she is, Jawani deed sahib jamal chinanke uftad as nur, and so forth. I mean, he saw such beauty and he's struck as if by an arrow to the heart. And he has this typical gesture, meaning awe, wonderment. Now here is when everything has worked out just fine, and the king sits with his beloved. This is actually probably Sam Mirza, brother to Shah Tahmasp when governor of Herat. And the poetry of Hafez specifies that a rose without the cheek of the beloved will just not be happy, nor will spring be happy without a cup of wine. So we're very much in the sensual pleasures of the court. But here, this early 17th century Isfahan school painting by Imad Hosseini is extraordinary in showing just as much in Islamic Persia as in Islamic Spain. You get this idea of the male who kneels before the woman. He kneels in humility, and she has taken his male symbol, his turban, and puts it on her head. So she is dominant, he kneels, and of course the nobleman's page bites his finger in astonishment. Now, the most famous stories in the Islamic world of the longing erotically expressed between man and woman becoming transformed into allegories of the yearning of the soul for the divine can go back and forth, with the soul symbolized as feminine and the divine manifestation as male, or opposite, the divine manifestation is female and the yearning soul is male. So one of these very famous stories, because it's in the Quran itself, the 12th surah of the Quran dedicated to the tale of Joseph, sold into slavery in Egypt by his jealous brethren, and who grew up as a servant in a rich Egyptian household where the lady of the house fell in love with him. And while her husband was away at court, she tried to trap Joseph in a wonderful chamber with locked doors, but Joseph tore himself away from her adulterous embrace, and she was left clutching nothing but a strip of clothing from his tunic. And so she'll accuse him. Well, after many adventures, Joseph will end up becoming prime minister of Egypt, and she, the lady Zuleika, will end up a widow, poor, old, bent, and ugly. And yet, when Joseph will ride by in his chariot, the lady will call out to him, "Do you remember me when I clutched at you so yearningly and you tore yourself away from my embrace?" Joseph looks upon her, recognizes her, and the eye of his mercy immediately transforms her back into the lovely young woman that she was, and they are wed. And when they wed, at one point, Joseph is so overcome with desire as she coquettishly moves away that he tears at her skirt and is left with a shred of clothing. This is meditated upon by Jami, who was one of the greatest Sufi poets of the 15th century, and we have here an illustration by the supreme master of Islamic painting, Master Behzad. This was done in 1488, and with this Egyptian story, we can call it the Rosetta Stone of all Islamic art. That's a tall order. Why? Because here we have Joseph tearing himself away from the lady Zuleika. The 7 stages of the castle are the 7 stages of divine revelation. The beauty of Joseph is a mirror of the divine beauty. So Zuleika is the soul yearning in the first stage through carnal desire, but she will be led by suffering and renunciation to the holy wedding in which Joseph welcomes her as the divine welcomes the soul. For those of you who are of South Asian Hindu tradition, you can immediately see the equivalent in the story of Radha and Krishna. It's Very, very much the same sort of story. In this particular wonderful painting, what we have is not only Bezod's signature, but the fact that this is supposed to illustrate a poem on the subject by Saadi, written 250 years earlier, and yet the verses of Jami are hidden in the tile work, and these verses by Jami, copied while Jami was the spiritual advisor to the king for whom this manuscript was illustrated, refer to the miracle of Jesus Christ to which the Quran refers. This is one of the very few medieval European representations of this miracle. The child Jesus wrought birds of clay, blew upon them, and gave them life. And Jami says, the artist who created this beautiful palace, like the Christ of the Quran, could paint a bird, blow upon it, and give it life. It was the sanctification of figurative art in this painting of courtly love. Now here, by Bezod's pupil, Sheikh-Zada, an illustration to another famous romance by Attar, early 13th century, and this is in its Turkish, Central Asian Turkish translation by Navai, telling another Christian-like story. Once upon a time, there was a certain sheikh in Mecca, and he was the most venerable, respectable of sheikhs. He was so stern. God is absolutely invisible, transcendent, above and beyond anything you can imagine. And if you don't agree, you are an idolater and a heretic and an unbeliever and a blasphemer. Yes, your lordship. Yes, your lordship. So everybody in Mecca has tremendous veneration for this character until a dream voice manifests itself to the sheikh in his sleep and tells him, God is extremely displeased with you. You evil, arrogant, self-important character. I will not accept your worship until you go to Constantinople, the city of the Christians, where they venerate icons. Go there. Learn from the Christians the secret of the image, and only then will I suffer you to come back to me. Meaning, learn the secret of love. Divine love is manifest. So the sheikh, in fright, immediately departs the next morning and walks all the way from Mecca to Constantinople with his disciples following in tow, and the sheikh looks up at a balcony when he enters the city and sees a lovely Christian princess. Now this is a Shiite representation, as we can tell from the turban, but this one is a Sunni one, meaning in the 16th century, this was one of the most popular motifs for the court artists. This is from the Uzbek Emirate of Bukhara. And what we see is the sheikh overcome with emotion at seeing the moment we have described. Here, the Christian maiden has pulled aside the curtain, kashful mahjub, the unveiling of that which was veiled, and the sight of the divine mirrored upon her countenance overcomes him. The palace of the princess is even depicted as a mihrab, direction of prayer, in which burns the flame of the Quranic tabernacle of light, Mishkat ul Anwar. This is a divine mystery, so that we have the poet Attar, who has explained this mystery by the Christian priests, and Navai, who translated Attar, is further commenting upon the episode. Now, here in this version from early 17th century Isfahan, all this from the poetry of Attar, we have our sheikh looking up to the lovely princess, and the painter adds, this is his own note, that she is dressed in red. Why so? In allusion to yet another poet. And this is so typical of medieval Persian painting. You, as an artist, comment upon what you illustrate directly through reference to another, as if you watch Prokofiev's ballet on Romeo and Juliet and you expect a reference to Shakespeare, which doesn't even have to be explicitly stated because it's part of the general culture. Who is the lady in red in Persian poetry? She is the lady of the red pavilion in the 7 pavilions or 7 icons of the poet Nizami. She is the cruel queen of a faraway brazen castle who will only be married by the prince who will be able to answer her riddle. All other princes must suffer their heads to be cut off if they fail to understand the riddle. It's the origin of the Turandot opera, in fact, ultimately. And the story means the divine is generous and cruel, merciful and wrathful. In order to deserve the divine, you must be willing to suffer martyrdom for her, to steep your love in heart's blood. And this is what the sheikh does as he calls up to her and she says, "You ugly old man," from her beautiful palace that looks like Paradise Garden. She says, you're old, you're ugly, you're a Muslim, and you expect to earn my love? And he says, "Do you want me to convert to Christianity?" Yes. Okay, well, what do I have to do? Drink wine? Oh, that's much too easy. If you want to prove to me that you've converted to Christianity, you must accept to become my swineherd. Keep my pigs. Then you will show true humility. So there he is, painted by a 16th century Uzbek artist, keeping her swine, and an Uzbek in 1560 had a very vague idea what pigs must look like, so he just painted boars. So the disciples, of course, are still following and trying to figure out what on earth is happening to our sheikh, but the princess, draping her red in green, comes to find the sheikh and says, "You have shown your love to me through your humility. Now accept my love and take me into your religion." So the lovers are united, and she dies on his lap, while the disciples, as you can see, are still wondering what's happening. And the poet Attar is explaining the scene to his spiritual disciple and Turkish translator, Navai. It's very, very typical of the way the authors are introduced into the poems. And the fundamental meaning of Attar's allegory is as follows. The sheikh in Mecca upheld the absolute invisibility and transcendence of God. But God is not only invisible, he is visible. And in his grace, he manifests himself in all the beauty of the visible world. You have transcendence and immanence, just as you have divine wrath and divine mercy. When the sheikh learns through humility to understand how the Christians worship the divine made manifest in icons, and impelled by love, learns the humility necessary for true mysticism, as opposed to the spiritual arrogance of a Wahhabi-type sheikh sitting there in Mecca telling the rest of the world what to believe. Only then, when he has lowered himself into the mire and even kept the pigs, will the reconciliation occur, and he becomes the supreme master of both immanence, beauty, love, and transcendence, majesty, wrath. This particular story, as you can see, was illustrated again and again in both Sunni and Shi'i courts throughout the Western Western Asian Islamic world in the 16th century, which is a good indication of the importance of this story, because these things are illustrated for kings. Now, we'll come to probably someone that we can call the Shakespeare of Islamic civilization, Nizami. Once Nizami writes something at the end of the 12th or early 13th century, the rest of his civilization then elaborates variations upon the themes of Nizami's love stories. Nizami, from what is today the territory of Azerbaijan, and who is called by his own civilization the Sheikh Ali Maqam, the master of most exalted rank, and Ayine Ghaib, the mirror of the unseen world. So this is the kind of manuscript illuminations that have preserved his work. And in this mid-15th century Timurid Herati example of a page as beautifully adorned as a Quran, you get already a secret key which is offered in the scribe's comments above, Makhzane Kaun Khusro u Shirin Nehod, underneath Khufr on ra Leilio Majnun Gushod, signifying the secret treasury which has been put together by the love story of King Khosroes and the lovely Shirin. The key to that mystery is to be found in the love story of Layla, meaning she whose tresses are so black that they are like a glorious night, and the mad one for love, Majnun. Every part of Nizami's poetry, as in Dante's poetry, throws light on every other part. So here are the two famous love stories of Nizami in various multiple illustrations. On the right, done by Sheikh Zadeh, Behzad's disciple in the early 16th century, King Khosroes, first discovers the lovely Christian queen Shirin of Armenia bathing in a pool in the mountains, and the king is overcome by her loveliness and, of course, bites his finger. On the left, you have an extraordinary folk art illustration from early 18th century India depicting the mad one for love, meaning Majnun, the mad one, who's become a hermit in the desert and a ferocious ascetic, something like the starving Buddha, and finally his lady love comes to visit him, and she's dressed like a Mughal empress, and this is the holy dialogue between the two lovers, Layli, as pronounced in the East, and Majnun. They will never touch in this life, whereas these two will marry. So it's variations. So here is illustrated by the great painter Sultan Muhammad in the early 16th century for Shah Tahmasp, Prince Khusro, or King Khusro, well, he's still a prince at this point, in the mountains, discovering the lovely Shirin bathing in a pool, and you can see that he bites his finger. And what you will see in every one of these paintings, meaning it's not arbitrary, it's not an accident, it's not whim, it is a profound iconological convention. What you have is a glorious plane tree shown in autumn, rising from the water. This represents the tree of life, which Ibn Arabi describes as, the great Spanish mystic of the 13th century, which he describes as when the perfect human prototype, insan kamil, perfect human, appeared in the world, the entire universe was like unto a tree. And the cosmic tree, on beholding the perfect vision of humanity, leaned, trembling with joy in all the multiplicity of its colors. It was Behzad himself who came upon the device of representing such a tree as a plane tree in autumn to show the multiplicity of colors. This means that the great tree itself, rising from the water of life, has recognized that the prince has seen upon the countenance of Shirin the mirroring of the divine. Now, I'll show this detail for two fun reasons. Well, three fun reasons. The first, obviously, she was sitting in a pool of silver. The artist knew that silver tarnishes. Within 2 generations, silver turns black. He knew that, but what did he care? He was doing it for his king, not for you. So we see these brooks and riverscapes and seascapes in Persian art, and we always wonder, why is the water black? It wasn't black, it was silver. Okay, that's the first. Second, if you look very carefully, you will see here faces. You see that? Eye, nose, mouth. Eye, snout, mouth. Eyes, nose, mouth. Another face here. You see them? You think they're there by accident? Of course not. Those are, in 15th and 16th century, into 17th century Persian and Indian art, visual allegories of one of the names of the devil, which in Arabic is Sahr, meaning the stone demon. According to legend, Solomon had a lot of trouble with that particular demon, who actually usurped his throne for 40 days, until Solomon, triumphant, finally locked that demon in a prison of stone forever. That particular demon symbolized everything that was wrong with Solomon when God punished him for his arrogance, his vainglory, his lust, his greed, his wrath, everything that a king shouldn't yield to, but Solomon did for 40 days. When Solomon recovers his wits, he can lock the demon of his own evil impulses in stone. This is the illusion that is multiplied in the art of this civilization, and what it signifies here is that unlike good King Khusro, the demon cannot recognize the mirroring of the divine upon the countenance of the perfect human being. It is a spiritual blindness. Now, here's the next part. We accept that the water turned black, and this was the painting which so deeply inspired Henri Matisse in the 20th century, whose debt to Persian painting is as profound as Picasso's to West African sculpture. And you can see how he was delighted with the surface patterns of Persian painting and reproduced it as the young lady against a patterned wallpaper. Now, King Khosrow will travel through the Caucasus Mountains in this painting by Sultan Muhammad to try to find the lovely queen. He will eventually come to her castle, and the artist shows double time, like in a Shakespeare play, the outer world and the inner world of the spirit. It is fairy castle, and there Shirin awaits her lover, and Shirin will give to Khosrow the book which is the 1001 Nights. How is this possible? Well, here, painted by Aura Mirac, we have Queen Shirin, now united to King Khosrow. She is actually higher than he is in hierarchy because she bears the kerchief of world rule. He doesn't. He must listen to her. She is his initiator into higher wisdom. And this is her mother, so she also has the imperial kerchief. The poet Nizami tells us that all these ladies together with Queen Shirin knew 1,000 tales and one tale. Hazar afsane o yek. What does this mean? 1001 is originally from Sanskrit, a symbolic number signifying infinity. The queen who tells 1,001 tales to her king initiates him into higher wisdom. Nizami was so profoundly familiar with the tales circulating in the Middle East of his day that he chose his own pen name, his chosen name, his Nizami, not his given name, his chosen name, because the numerical value of the letters composing Nizami come to 1,001. And he says it, Dar nami nizami gar nehigam bini adade hazoro yaknom. If you should step 1 foot into the circle of Nizami's name, you will discover therein 1,001 names. Queen Shirin is a Scheherazade prototype. Scheherazade means Chehre-Azad, signifying noble countenance. And it was the title of Queen Homai of the Shahnameh. So the detail, courtly love exalted, and now courtly love unhappy. This is another famous romance inserted into the tale of Khosrow Shirin, where Shirin, sitting in her palace here, is approached by her chamberlain, who introduces a magnificent sculptor and architect and artist, Farhad, at her service. And when Farhad, in this early 15th century Tabriz painting, sees Shirin, he falls in love with her, but of course she is wedded to King Khosrow. So he becomes the Lancelot, the servant who will never or should never be united to his beloved. So here is another vision of in this mid-15th century version of the meeting between the sculptor, Farhad, and Queen Shirin, bearing the kerchief of her imperial rank. And this effect of a cherry tree in blossom seen through a window, also indicating that she is, as it were, the lady who sits in the mihrab, the niche of prayer, the focus of adoration. This also was seen, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't catch it. Oh, well, it was seen by Matisse. Anyway, these are one of the many things that Farhad does. He has carved beautiful carvings in the mountains. The queen, in this 15th century Shirazi manuscript, has come to visit him. Her horse stumbles and goes lame, and Farhad is so strong that he can lift up the very horse with the queen on his shoulders. Or here, in the version by Rezaye Abbasi, done practically 200 years later in Isfahan. He does so many wonders that in this late 16th century Indian Mughal painting, Farhad has actually carved a channel through the mountains to bring milk for the delectation of the queen. And you can see all these faces in the rocks. These faces cannot understand the queen's beauty. Farhad does. Then here, the queen comes to visit Farhad. Her beauty is too much for him, and in this case, he faints in this early 16th century rendition. Or here, one of the most tragic scenes in Islamic literature of the classical age, the suicide of Farhad, painted by Behzad in 1494. The king has heard about the passion of Farhad and sends a messenger to tell Farhad that the queen has sickened and died. And Farhad commits suicide by throwing himself from the top of a cliff. And the messenger goes, oh, sorry about that. Now, if you look carefully, you will see the conceit of the devil in stone. These stones are examples of the damnation of Farhad. Farhad signifies the artist who has tried to capture the divine in plastic form and tragically fails to do so. The lovely queen belongs to Khosrow, not to him. we will find in Persian, Turkish, and Urdu poetry continual references of the individual poets, all the way down to Ghalib, saying, I am Farhad, meaning how humble can I become? The divine will forever remain closed unto me. It is a symbol of the tragedy of the unappeased, unwelcomed soul. And so if you look carefully at the rocks, what you see is that they are open mouths, screaming in despair and hiding their eyes with a stone paw. You see it? You catch the conceit? There's the open mouth. They're doing this. And in case the prince for whom this was painted, Prince Sultan Hussein Mirza Baykara of Herat, didn't get the point, you also have another Ibn Arabi image here, which are the withered stumps. Unlike the tree of life, withered stumps signify those branches of the tree of life that have been cut off from the tree of life and no longer receive the divine sap. They represent damnation, and they are clawing the sky in their torment. Well, things don't end up so well either for Khosrow Shirin. In Behzad's painting here, Khosrow is murdered, Arthur by Mordred type of archetype, by his own son Shiruye, and who seizes the throne, and Shirin, in this painting by Sultan Muhammad, throws herself in despair upon Khosrow's tomb and dies. So it's a romance of a kind of triangle. The love between the king and queen results in the king's higher wisdom, whereas the third character, the courtly lover Farhad, is doomed to permanent despair. So now we'll come to the last of our romances. This is the rosette, which was designed for Emperor Akbar at the end of his copy of the tale of Khosrow Shirin. And here we'll come to the story of Layla, Arabic pronunciation, or Layli, Eastern Islamic pronunciation, and Majnun, which means the mad one for love, one of the Khamsa, meaning the 5 great poems of Nizami. So here is one of the frontispieces from a dispersed manuscript showing Nizami himself on the left instructing his own child. And very interestingly, all the romances of Nizami begin Dar Nasihatte Farzand Khesh, meaning in instruction to my own child, signifying that every reader of Nizami's romances is the poet's child and must learn from the poet. Here, in one of the most extraordinarily important paintings of all Islamic culture in the significance of allegory that we find revealed, Behzad has painted the moment when in school a 13-year-old boy, Qais, with little girls in school too. 1494 Herat, I used to show this painting to the Taliban. School? Yes. Boys and girls? Yes. Western influence. No, this was painted right here at Herat, 1494. And you know where the school is? It's in a mosque. How do you know it's a mosque? Don't you guys know how to read? What does it say here? Oh. It's a mosque, all right. Now, what is happening is you have the schoolmaster here who is imparting the lesson of what is happening, and this schoolmaster is the poet Nizami himself. And what has happened here is that Layla, or Layli, this other 13-year-old girl, is sitting in the niche of prayer itself. How do you know it's the niche of prayer? Well, because it says so. وَهُوَ قَائِمٌ يُصَلِّي فِي الْمِحْرَابِ. Upright is he who worshipeth in the mihrab. And then the poem says that the very wind, Baude kize oshiqi khabar dasht borqa ze jamal khish bardasht, signifying the very breeze when it became aware of love. Because Qais, sitting under his tree, has breathed the perfume of Layli, who was rather heavily veiled. But the breeze took mercy on Qais and wafted away the veil, and it fell from her countenance, and it says, and the burqa was uplifted from her beauty. Kashful mahjub, the unveiling of that which is veiled. So as a consequence, Qais dips his stylus into his inkwell to write his first love poem in her praise. And this is the manifestation of the divine beauty mirrored upon her countenance. And the tree of life understands this and shelters Qais like a canopy, which has recognized the saint. And the water of life in this case is the ablution fount of the mosque. You actually have whole verses in Nizami in which Majnun, as he's growing mad for love of her, says, Ey Kaaba man, O thou art my Kaaba. Ey mihrab man, O thou art my mihrab. Even the arches of your eyebrows are the arches of the niche of prayer. You are the focus of my devotion. So you have a variation on this painting done 100 years later, 80 years later by Muhammadi of Herat, where you can see clearly that Layla has been, or Layli has been depicted as the queen of heaven. She has a royal crown, dangling from her sleeve the kerchief of royalty, and she sits in the mihrab. So she is the focus of devotion. As Ibn Arabi says, the divine may become manifest in female as well as male aspect, which always surprises those unacquainted with the Sufi tradition of Islam. And here is the central mystery of this painting. According to the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, the divine creates the world, but it is only the human mind which can reflect the divine, in the sense of think the divine. Therefore, human eyes are the eyes through which the divine looks upon the divine. And here you see the divine as the queen of heaven, looking at herself, because narcissi in Eastern Islamic art are symbols of human eyes. That's the mystery. This is called in classical Arabic Sufism, Abhar al-Ashiqin, meaning the Narcissus of the lovers. Here, further, in illustration to Saadi, the pondering of the mystery, whereby one painter comments upon one poet, the sheikh of mystical initiation, who looks exactly like the symbolized aspect of the divine intellect, guide to human souls, described by Avicenna as appearing as a wise old man, is here. And here, this has been a wonderful discovery. This was painted in 1488, and it is Behzad's self-portrait. Whereas here, we get Nizami himself as the Sheikh of initiation. Or here, painted in 1486, we have Nizami in the very center of the dreamland of the poets, the Sheikh of initiation. Here attended by Jami and Navai, while all these are ghosts. Navai, who writes in Turkish, is admitted into the company of the great Persian language poets of the past. Nizami again, the tongue, the mirror of the unseen world, in a Mughal Indian variation from 1610 by Muhammad Ali of Golconda. Now back to the theme. Even when Behzad illustrates Saadi, as here, he constantly refers to the Majnun and Layli story, so that you will get again Layli sitting in the mihrab, Wallah illah siwahu, and there is no God but he, and she sits there, while Qais writes the first poem in her praise. Further variations, I wonder why that's trembling, but maybe that's the emotion that Qais feels in the great mosque painted in the 1440s. And Qais has gone so mad for love that the parents try to organize a marriage, but Layli's clan will have nothing to do with Majnun's clan, so it's kind of a Romeo and Juliet opposing clans type of story, and Qais truly goes mad and becomes Majnun, the mad one. He was possessed by the genie, and Majnun's father decides to take him to Mecca to see if a pilgrimage to the Kaaba, and this illustration by Bezad, might not cure Majnun, but instead Majnun hammers on the symbolic door of the Kaaba and says, "Layla, Layla, let me in." Here, again, fruitless negotiations between Majnun's father and Layli's father. They're all supposed to be Arabian Bedouin of the early 8th century AD, but this is very much stylized by Mir Sayyid Ali as a glorious Safavid royal hunting expeditions camp. This painting is of some importance because it was created by one of the masters who was called by Emperor Humayun to Kabul in the 1550s and became one of the founders of the Mughal school of art. Then here you get the great renunciation. Qais tells his rather wealthy father, "I will leave, I will abandon. Since Layli is promised to another man, I cannot renounce my love for Layli. I will retire into the desert." And despite the pleading father, here Majnun is determined to leave the family home. You have people here who are reading his story. And here again, you have the tree of life rising from the water of life. So now you're all becoming experts in what is not a whimsical art at all. The tree of life has recognized that there is a true saint here. Then here, once out of the family camp, Qais, or Majnun, dismounts from his horse in this mid-15th century Herati painting and exchanges his rather wealthy young man's clothes against the clothes of a beggar. And now he will become a mad one for God, a holy hermit. This is a spiritual paradigm that those of you familiar with the Western Christian tradition immediately recognize. Francis renounces his wealth and exchanges his clothes with a beggar in Giotto's rendition from the early 14th century, because Francis himself will proclaim himself Giocoliere di Dio, pazzo di Dio. I am God's juggler. I am God's madman. The influence of Sufism upon the early Franciscan movement is so overwhelming that it took 15th and 16th century persecution by the Inquisition fully to camouflage what is an obvious attestation. The obvious attestation is where we get the great Franciscans of the 13th century saying things like, "The Saracens have people of great holiness, whom they call the Sufis, whose stories inspire great devotion and love, and upon which we must model ourselves." The very habit of the first mendicants, the Franciscans, are holy fools who wander without fixed abode from city to city as beggars, who welcome the jeers and the mocks, the patched robe, moraka, khirqa. It's exactly Sufi. And of course, the Franciscans were the great pioneers of Arabic studies in 13th century Europe. The ultimate paradigm, the renunciation of Prince Gautama Siddhartha. I get off my horse, my earthly desires, I exchange my clothes against those of a beggar. It is much too often forgotten that the entire eastern part of what we call the Islamic world today, before Islam, was Buddhist. Eastern Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, North India, of course, all these areas were Buddhist, and much of it has seeped into the Sufi tradition. Here we have Majnun in the wilderness, done by Aura Mirac in the 16th century. He is a poet, and he sings his verses to the beasts who are tamed, and he even sees the eyes of his beloved in those of a gazelle. And this, again, is very close to the Franciscan paradigm. Francis preaching to the birds, the soul birds, in Giotto's version. Here, everybody comes to consult Majnun in his oasis here, and while in the background you can see the Layli Layli, you have the visitors who dig down from dictation the beautiful verses that Majnun sings in her praises. Then, again, a Franciscan paradigm. The parallel, you see the holy wedding of Francis to the three ladies, faith, hope, and charity, obviously allegorical. Then here, one of the stories told by Majnun is how kings themselves must climb down from their horses and show obedience to the holy fools, the holy hermits, who consider themselves to be the lovers of Layli. And again, Turkish, Persian, Urdu poetry abound with the poets who call themselves Majnun. If they call themselves Majnun, it means that the beloved is Layla. If the beloved is Layla, they are Sufi poets. The beloved is the divine as Layla. Here, in a particular instance of this, we're almost coming to the conclusion. This is a version done by Abdus Samad, one of the Safavid painters who went to Kabul to Humayun's court in the 1550s, and who's another one of the founders of the Mughal school. And it shows, of course, Majnun in the desert among the animals. And this is Prince Akbar himself, still wearing the kind of hat that was fashionable in Humayun's time, in Kabul, learning to paint this scene while he listens to the tale of Layli Majnun sung to him by an attendant, implicating the future Emperor Akbar himself in the story of the holy lover, the holy madman, the holy fool. There's a Mughal Indian version which was actually painted by a Hindu master for Emperor Akbar, showing Majnun in the wilderness, surrounded by all his tame animals, with his mother and father pleading with him to come home, which he will not do. And you get all the atmospheric effects of Mughal Indian painting, wonderfully absorbing Renaissance European influences, but maintaining all these symbols like the tree of life and the demons locked in stone. Then we come to what should be good news for Majnun, which is that Layli's husband has died, and here's the mourning ceremony painted by Behzad with a wonderful detail of a mourner wearing the blue of mourning. Nevertheless, the clan arrogantly will still refuse Layla's hand to Majnun. So an Arab nobleman called Naufal says, I've had enough of this, and he declares war on Layla's clan, and they battle, as in this mid-15th century illumination. And this one by Behzad, showing the violence of the clash between the Bedouin tribes, has Majnun looking on in despair. He's not happy about this at all. He will plead with the combatants, much like Romeo, stop it. But in Majnun's case, it signifies, I will not win my beloved through the violence of unleashed anger. I must tame my wrath. So here, Majnun is led by a chain, as the madman that he is, in this painting by Mir Sayyid Ali, by an old woman, to the camp of Layla to contemplate her, and the children throw stones at him, mocking him as a madman. The details by Muhammadi, another meditation on Majnun just outside the camp of the lovely Layli, second half of the 16th century. Then here, in Jami's late 15th century poetic version, you have Majnun, who has actually disguised himself as a goat. There's his face, in order to be led by a herder to contemplate Layli, who wears red, of course. Spill your heart's blood. They too will never be united in this world, but they will be united in paradise. So you have the holy conversation between Majnun and Layli from the early 18th century, and here is one of the very earliest illustrations extant of the romance, actually from the Delhi Sultanate, done in the very early 15th century, one of the very early ones to survive, from Amir Khosrow's version. Layli has died. Majnun throws himself upon her tomb and starves to death upon her tomb, from which he never moves, and he is guarded as the king that he truly is, and as the queen that she truly is, by the twin lions. He says to her, "Now I know where you dwell. O my lady of the red cloak, you dwell in the brazen castle of the other world. Await me there. O symbol of the divine, beyond the threshold of the tomb." And this is the crowning apotheosis between the twin lions, and so you get Emperor Akbar's rosette again on his copy of this romance. Thank you.